No, Katie's, hand over to you. You can start.
Someone's. And are you going to record?
Let me start recording.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's dive straight in and start with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you that we have the opportunity to have a short break. I pray that that break may have benefited both myself and everyone else. And I thank you that we can continue in our journey together. I praise you for all these gracious gifts that you give to us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So I'll start with a very brief recap just to highlight the point that I was trying to make. There's two ways of looking at the seventh kingdom or the king of the north. There's two ways of understanding the king of the north. The king of the north can either be understood as two separate entities, like what we saw in the papacy, where it's church over state. So it's the church telling the state what to do and the state just going along with it. Or the second option, which we see more clearly demonstrated in Babylon, is this idea of the two being one. So my high school art reminded me that about color combinations. I thought to do a little bit of picture work to drive home the point, which is you're going to get two entities. So this could be the church, this could be the state. They're going to come together and they're going to infuse to make something new. So it's made up of two things, but it's this third thing that it is. So it becomes one entity. And that's what I'm suggesting you see in Babylon and you see in the last kingdom, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the seventh kingdom, this resurrected, more glorious entity. Whereas your second entity, so now if you want to call it the third option, which is I'm describing as state nationalism. In your first one, if you would think of it as church over state, it's these two separate entities working together to accomplish something. Whereas in this option, it's the two coming together in a way that makes them one. And I think this is more glorious in the context of the King of the North because it's more able to accomplish its purposes and do it in a way that the Fifth Kingdom couldn't. So that was the key takeaway that I wanted. When we talk about the sin of the Seventh Kingdom or the thing that drives the Seventh Kingdom, it's state nationalism. And this is what state nationalism looks like. It looks like the state with an ideology that's going to seek to implement that ideology at home. We call that domestic policy. With its domestic policies, and abroad, we call that foreign policy. So with how it's going to rule the nations around us. When we split up this idea of first the glorious land and then the world, so you would have seen us talk about national Sunday law and worldwide Sunday law. This is really just domestic policy. And this is foreign policy. How the nation is going to rule itself, to cement its ideology at home, and how the state/nation is going to project that outward to the nations around it as it seeks to conquer Greece, the world. So that's just a brief recap. I wanted to put that in place first. So now we could contrast that with the sixth kingdom. So in Revelation 17, going back to Revelation 17, in verse 8, we learnt about the beast that was, is not, and shall ascend. But in the same chapter, there's other imagery that we're given, other symbols, which is the heads. There's 7 heads that are going to be described. And so in verse 10, if you can go with me there, we're going to learn about these heads. Now, this is tricky because these heads are on the beast. But these heads are not the beast. So they're on the beast, but they are not the beast. They're heads. So when we get to verse 10, and it talks about 7 kings, well, really verse 9, because the 7 heads are 7 mountains, and those mountains are kingdoms. The king represents a kingdom. So in verse 10, when it says there's 7 kings, John is going to get it explained to him that 5 are fallen. Remember, this is 1798. That's the point at which John is standing. 5 are fallen. 1 is, so this is the past. This is the present. Sorry. And this is the future. Your 6th, because after 5 is 6, is the one that is, and the other is not yet come. So not yet means it's coming in the future. I'll just write yet to come. And this is your 7 in that sequence. And then when the 7th comes, it's going to continue for a short space. So this dilemma that we have is that while this beast is not in this time period when it's dead, there's a 6th kingdom that is. It's working, it's alive. So we need to be able to distinguish between this 6th kingdom and the beast, despite the fact that this head is on the beast. If the two were the same, that this kingdom, the 6th head, is the beast, if this was the case, Then when the beast dies, the sixth would have to be dead as well. And then here we would say not as well. But by the mere fact that we're told that this one is, that it is alive, we can conclude that the sixth is not the beast, is not this persecuting power, is not this, doesn't have this persecuting spirit. So when we consider the sixth kingdom, the kingdom that's rising up in 1798, who do we associate that kingdom with? Perhaps this one can be a bit more dialogue. Does anyone want a feedback just as we can go through it together? 1798, we have a kingdom rising up. Who do we associate that kingdom with?
The USA.
Mhm. So the sixth kingdom is coming up, and it's the USA. And in Revelation 13, verse 11, that kingdom is described as the Lamb. This Lamb is not the beast. They're two separate entities. Even though the head is on the beast. The key thing is that this kingdom isn't the beast, even though the head is on the beast. So we need to figure out what it means for those heads to be on the beast, but not be the beast. In ancient Israel, there was this, I'm not going to call it state nationalism, because it wasn't exactly, but there was this union, like what we've described about state nationalism, between church and state, in a way where it was pretty much like Babylon, where the state and the religious authority were one. They were inseparable. You had the judges, who were both the political branch as well as the moral branch, the religious authority of the nation. And then you see that with the king and the kings that are set up and the priesthood and etc. The nation of Israel was just this combination of religion and state mixed as one. You couldn't separate the two. The two were so infused that you can't have them as two separate things. In fact, God just joins that for their own good. But in the time period of the Old Testament, you have the two together as one entity. And so we refer to Israel, Judah more specifically, once they get divided, as the glorious land. And this glorious land that we have in ancient Israel is both the state entity and the religion that makes up Israel, or the ideology. They're interchangeable because they go hand in hand. By the time you get to 1798, and now church and state are going to separate with regards to the papacy. The Pope is going to be taken into captivity with the deadly wound and etc. This union of church and state is going to collapse. And you're going to have two separate entities rise up under the premise of the sixth kingdom. You're going to get a state which is constitutionally founded on the separation of church and state. That's a lamb, the USA. And you're going to get something else born that's going to represent the church. What is born that represents the church that's rising up in 1798? In the glorious land, they were as one, but now they're going to be separated for their own good. But in 1798, there's two things that we mark as rising up in 1798. The USA, and what else? Adventism. We can draw Adventism right back to the birth of the Millerite movement with William Miller. So post 1798 with the Millerites and fully established in 1863, we have the remnant establishing itself. So this beast is going to come up out of the earth, Revelation 13. But at the same time, in Revelation 12, we're told that this church is going to flee into the wilderness. And the dragon is going to pursue it, and etc. And then it's going to find refuge in the USA, essentially. So the collapse of this papal church-state union is going to lead to the emergence of two distinct prophetic entities: the state that represents God's civil ideals, and a church that reflects God's spiritual truth, that's going to have the ideology that God wants for their people, for the church, for the truth. Thus, when we look at this lamb-like beast, we have to think of it in a dual sense. It's the sixth kingdom, and it's rising up out of the earth, this new unpopulated area, that's going to be a refuge for the church, for God's people, much like ancient Israel was meant to be. This lamb-like beast is Christ-like in origin, much like ancient Israel's calling. So when we think about this sixth kingdom, we can think of it as reflecting the glorious land in its state expression. So we have sixth kingdom, USA is equal to sixth kingdom. And the USA as the sixth kingdom, we know that the USA that's rising in 1798, when we talk about the glorious land in Daniel 11 verse 41, is the same thing. The USA equals the glorious land. So if USA equals sixth kingdom and USA equals glorious land, just basic algebra, A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So this sixth kingdom is also the glorious land, ancient Israel in its state expression. The reason why this becomes important for me in seeing this link is because we can look at ancient Israel to understand it as a type, or understanding the sin of the sixth kingdom as the antitype. Just to package all this together, in 1798, the papal supremacy marks the end of the papal supremacy, marks a turning point. And out of this turning point, you have two new entities arise. You have the USA, which is representing your lamb-like state with Christ-like civil principles. And you have Adventism, representing the remnant church, which has the spiritual truth. These two are typologically the glorious land reborn. When we speak about it in verse 41, we're talking about the state-nation bit. And that's what makes Acts 27 so powerful, because you can compare and contrast Adventism with the sixth kingdom, because they serve different functions of the same thing, just two different versions of it. They're both the glorious land, but when we speak about it in a specific context, it has to be understood in that context, this dual thing. My point is that when we compare the sixth kingdom with Israel, we can compare and contrast the glorious land with the sixth kingdom. They're interchangeable. So to identify the sin of the sixth kingdom, we need to be precise with regards to its job function. To understand the sin of the USA, Adventism, as different to the sin of the seventh kingdom. In Acts 27, that's a story about the sixth kingdom. about the protector or defender of the people, specifically when we talk about the ship of Alexandria. It starts its journey in 1798 and it goes through all those different phases. And then it gets to Snyder's. I'm just going to highlight specific points in that in 1863. And this ship is going to go off course. The off course bit that we associate with Adventism is the rejection of the 2520. And we'll explore why the rejection of the 2520 specifically takes that ship off course. If this ship is a good ship, the defender of the people, why would the 2520 mean that it goes off course for Adventism? And we can compare and contrast that with the Sixth Kingdom because they share the same properties. It's just now in two different versions or faces of what they're protecting. Adventism protecting the spiritual truths and the state protecting the civil aspects of the kingdom that God is trying to raise up. So to understand this, I'd like to compare and contrast Ellen White's commentary about the lamb-like beast and ancient Israel. We'll come back to the line of Acts 27 as we fill it in, but I just wanted to set the context of the study as we try to answer the question of what is the sin of the Sixth Kingdom in comparison to the Seventh Kingdom. Seventh Kingdom, state nationalism. Sixth Kingdom, what is its sin? Because in isolating the sins of the two, we can see how later down the road, the judgment for the two is different. So this beast is going to rise up out of the earth in Revelation 13 verse 11 with two lamb-like horns. And Ellen White is going to give a lot of description about this history. She's going to talk about Roger Williams and his first colony on the East Coast and the fact that it's set up under specific principles. The principles that everyone should be able to worship God according to the light of their own conscience. Ellen White is writing in a time period where there's a lot of skepticism towards the papacy. Coming out of the Dark Ages, that was at the forefront of Protestants' minds. We see that in how they framed 1850 and how they framed 1888, despite the fact that the threat was much bigger than Catholicism. The threat was the nation itself, the state itself, and how it viewed itself. So she's going to write all of her commentary in Great Controversy with a specific focus, and that focus is the papacy. So for her, the principles that are going to make up the Sixth Kingdom are going to be described in the light of religious liberty. She speaks about how the foundational principles that made up Roger Williams' colony are going to form the basis of the American Republic, the cornerstone of the American Republic, civil and religious liberty. I'm reading from Great Controversy, page 290, around there. I'm not reading from it, I'm paraphrasing. And in Great Controversy, she's going to speak about two documents. She's going to speak about the Declaration of Independence and she's going to speak about the Constitution. These documents served different purposes, connected, but different purposes. The Declaration of Independence essentially housed the principles that the Sixth Kingdom was going to enshrine, that the Sixth Kingdom was going to live by. Those principles of essentially human rights, that every human has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, to get stuff, to the pursuit of happiness. There's this understanding that our happiness is tied to the accumulation of stuff. Now, these principles in the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson writes it, were just principles. They weren't enforceable. It's not a legally binding document. When they declare independence from Britain, it's Thomas Jefferson and everyone else who had a part in the Declaration of Independence saying, we are no longer going to be tied to you because there are certain principles that we believe we should live by. And these principles are fundamentally in tension with how you've run your kingdom in the old world. But here's our principles. Now, if we have these principles in the Declaration of Independence, it's not legally binding. So what did they need to do? They needed to get those principles, and a few years later, as they recognized that you can't run a country like this with just principles because everyone ends up doing their own thing, they came together and decided, let's create a constitution. Let's take those principles and codify them. Let's put them into law. And that's what the Constitution does. It codifies the principles. You see this same dynamic in ancient Israel. The principles, love God, love your neighbor, are great in and of themselves. But if you have them just as principles that you're going to describe, one, everyone interprets those principles differently. And two, you cannot enforce them. Because what if someone doesn't want to live by those principles? So Moses stands up and recognizes that, well, Moses alongside God are going to recognize that I have these principles, but you, my people, need to be guided. And so here come the 10 commandments. Simply put, split into the 4 and the 6. Love God, your first 4 commandments. Love your neighbor, your last 6. Those principles run through those codified laws, those codified institutions. In the sacrificial system that you see in ancient Israel, whether it's the sanctuary or the Levitical laws and everything about the Jewish economy, is created around this idea of codifying certain principles that God has for their kingdom. Love God, love your neighbor. So Ellen White is going to describe the rise of this 6th kingdom in this way, that there are principles in the Declaration of Independence. Those principles need to be codified. So in that paragraph that I'm referring to in Great Controversy, 295, I think it's paragraph 3, he says the framers of this constitution, everyone that came together, recognize that there are principles that should guide our behavior. Reasoning was not necessary to establish this truth. Everyone knows it, knows that these are the principles that each individual has. The idea of self-government, self-autonomy, with regards to how they're going to view their relationship with God. Again, she's going to frame everything around God, but it's really related to human rights more broadly, pluralism. Going on, later down the road, she's going to describe this lamb-like beast, and this lamb-like beast is going to be represented by republicanism and Protestantism. Principles found in the Constitution, because this Constitution is going to guarantee the rights that the Declaration of Independence speaks about. They weren't guaranteed before, but now they're going to be guaranteed because the Constitution is going to do that work of guaranteeing them. This is where I'm reading from. America, the USA, is going to act as an asylum from persecution for your Christian exiles, your remnant that are going to run into this haven. And she says these people who were running from persecution, their views about establishing a government based on civil and religious liberty are going to be found in the Declaration of Independence, the principle. And the Constitution is going to guarantee these principles that they found in the Declaration of Independence. I'm saying this in different ways so we can see the distinction between the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The principle and what today we would call as the policy, but it's more than a policy, it's an institution. Because that Constitution has various institutions that make it a constitution. There's different ways of describing institutions. So, in fact, first we'll describe a principle. I've said this term several times. Your principles are your fundamental truths that are going to serve as the foundation for your belief system, whether it's you as an individual, a company, or the country, the nation. So what do you hold to be true? Self-evidently. And you're going to use that to guide your actions. It's a rule or belief that's going to govern your behavior. They're basic truths, they're fundamental ideas, etc. So Ellen White is going to describe republicanism and Protestantism as the principles that were meant to guide or that were meant to make the sixth kingdom the sixth kingdom. It found its prosperity and its wealth, its greatness in those principles. When we think of an institution, however, there's different ways of describing institutions. Aldertes used it in a specific framework to describe an organization. However, institutions could be described in a different way. So depending on the study we're doing, you have to be sure as to how you're describing institution. And Alder Parminder has described it in the way that I'm going to describe it now, where your institution is your structured or established systems of rules, of practices, of behavior that's going to shape the government's or the organization's behavior in society and community in a specific area. And these institutions can be formal or informal. A formal institution would be something that is officially established through laws, through regulations, through constitutions. So an example is governments. Your government could be an institution, schools, or corporations, or a religious organization. Those would be formal institutions. Your informal institutions are things that come about through custom, through tradition. So if we think of marriage, it's a formal institution. The Sabbath, marriage an informal institution because it's a custom that God established. The Sabbath, again, it's a custom. It's part of social norms. It's unwritten. It's not codified. So your institutions take your principles and they say, okay, let's make those principles law now. So whether it's the various parts of the Constitution that look to safeguard and put into practice the principles, it could be the separation of the three different branches. It could be checks and balances. It could be the amendment process. All those things that make up the Constitution are put in place to protect the various principles that are penned in the Declaration of Independence. Another institution that we can think of is the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, those various amendments that get added to the Constitution to protect the principles in a more explicit way. In simple terms, the Declaration of Independence states the principles that the Sixth Kingdom is built on, and the Constitution creates the institutions, the government systems and rules that are meant to protect and uphold those principles. So as I said, we can see that in ancient Israel with regards to how it views the principles of love God and love your neighbor, and how it goes about enforcing those through the Old Testament law, through the literal law, the Ten Commandments, as well as the Mosaic law, the Jewish economy with the sacrificial system and etc. So if we have ancient Israel on one hand, and we have the Sixth Kingdom on the other, both reflective of the glorious land, we can see how we can look to ancient Israel to find out what their sin was, to see what the sin of the Sixth Kingdom is. I hope those steps make sense. So, in the time of Christ, the end of ancient Israel, there were various institutions that were set up. I spoke about the Ten Commandments, I spoke about the temple, the sanctuary service. It could be the way in which they viewed tithe, the way in which they viewed the various holidays that God gave, whether it's Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles. All those various things were institutions given to Israel for their benefit, to protect the principles that God wanted them to give to the wider world. Love me, God, and love your neighbor. Protect human rights. These institutions were meant to do that thing. But Jesus comes along after John has called out the Pharisees and done his work, and Jesus describes Israel as corrupt. In Matthew 21, Jesus is going to march into the temple. This is describing the temple cleansing, and he's going to say, "You people have corrupted my temple. I told you that my house is a house of prayer. The purpose of this institution is to protect your relationship with me." That's what a house of prayer is. It's your communication with me in this relationship. That's what my house is. So this institution was meant to protect this principle. Just breaking that down. My house, the sanctuary, is the institution that I gave you. And the purpose of this house was a house of prayer. In recent studies, Aldaparminda started, well, he's been going on about it for a while now, but the key theme of that is that prayer serves as a tool for your relationship with God. So if you can think of the principle that house, that prayer was meant to establish its relationships. So that's the principle that God wanted the institution to be used for. Remember me, I'm your God. This is where you come to do that thing, to maintain that principle. And Jesus says, this is what it was created for, but instead you've turned that institution into a den of thieves. So this institution has become corrupt. Now it's no longer serving its original purpose, which was yours and my relationship. And instead, it's now serving a different purpose. Now it's a den of thieves, i.e., it's serving a principle of selfishness because you are using this institution to line your pockets, essentially. So the temple, meant to be this place of true worship, is turned into a marketplace, essentially exploitation. It's turned into an exploitative system. In Matthew chapter 15, throughout that whole commentary between Jesus and the Pharisees, I won't read it, but essentially Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and he's rebuking them. And his rebuke is directed towards the fact that they've taken God's commandments, the institutions that God gave them, and replaced them with human traditions. It's like allowing people to avoid supporting their parents under the guise of religious devotion. So they've looked at these commandments that God gave with a specific intention to protect certain principles and said, you've replaced my institution that I've given you with a substitute institution created in your eyes. And when you do that, the principle that I wanted to achieve in cultivating in you is now lost because now it's going to serve your own interests. So this abuse of institution leads to worship of another set of principles. In Desire of Ages, page 84, I think it's chapter 1 or 2, around there, Ellen White is going to describe the state of Israel by the time you get to Jesus and John's birth. Jesus is going to look at all the traditions and rites that God gave them and see that they've got to a point where they possess no virtue. That this service that they're doing has now just become a round of ceremonies. So the principles have been lost sight of. My point, just to encapsulate all that, is that these institutions have been hijacked. The Jewish economy, the sanctuary, the house of prayer, the commandments, everything has been hijacked and they've been abused. God gave them to Israel, to ancient Israel, with a specific purpose: to protect the people, to protect human rights, and to protect and keep in the remembrance of people their relationship with God. When we consider the line of Christ, or the line of the end of ancient Israel, to be more specific, we have 4 BC, then you have 27 AD with the baptism of Jesus, and then I'll skip a few up until the cross, and then you get to Pentecost, and then 34 AD. My focus is on the cross, because it's at the cross where you see something fundamentally change between what Paul calls the old covenant, i.e., the institutions that God put in place to point to certain principles. Those are going to be, I'll say it loosely, done away with. The cross is the point in time when the ceremonial law, i.e., those institutions, are replaced. They need to be replaced because they're no longer serving the purpose that God wanted for them. And then by the time you get to 34 AD, the Jewish church as a whole is passed by because they've lost sight of what the original intent was for the institutions. So when we consider Acts 27 and we consider modern Israel, let's go back to the ship of Alexandria. It's the defender of God's people. That's what its job function is. And I said that in 1863, that ship goes off course because it has rejected the 2520. So what does rejecting the 2520 have to do with this job function of protecting or being a defender of God's people? What are the principles that we spoke of? Love God, love your neighbor. So what does rejecting a time prophecy have to do with that, with not fulfilling that job function? I gave a brief definition of what an institution is. It's a thing to codify something. If we think of the 2520 and the context in which it was given, that prophecy was given, outside of its original intent, obviously, we can go to verse 1 to 3 to see the context of said 2520. God is essentially going to say, don't make idols, don't make graven images, no idolatry. Keep my Sabbath and respect my sanctuary. If you do these things and keep my commandments, then I'm going to bless you. But if you don't do these things, i.e., if you end up making idols, if you end up not respecting my sanctuary, if you end up not keeping the Sabbath, then you're going to be cursed. The blessings and the cursings. The principles that needed to be protected were love God, love your neighbor. And if you don't do that, then you're going to be cursed. So the 2520 is going to package all of that into this covenant between God and humanity. And the 2520 is going to be the thing that institutionalizes that covenant of blessings or cursings. So when we think of what's happening here in 1863 with the 2520 being rejected, it's the rejection of an institution that was meant to remind ancient Israel, God's people, of who they are, of what their purposes are, embedding those principles. You reject the 2520, there's this loss of accountability between you and God. Your love-God relationship is broken. If you reject the 2520, there's this forgetfulness of the love your neighbor bit, the principles of justice, mercy, equity. And we see that demonstrated how Adventism has lost sight of prophecy. You reject the 2520, you have no prophetic bearing anymore. So when you get to 1989 and the king of the north is going to be resurrected and you want to understand the workings of the man of sin, just putting 2SM in the chat, you're not going to be able to do that because Ellen White is going to describe prophecy as historical events set before the people, a figurative delineation leading down to the end. And it's that last bit that becomes the important part for me, is that the scenes connected with the working of the man of sin are going to be revealed. If you have a correct bearing of where you are in prophecy, you're going to understand what the sin is of the man of sin. So if you want to understand said man of sin, what do you need? You need prophecy. You need the 2520, because it's the 2520 that's going to remind you. The whole context of the Sabbath is this thing of remember. Remember everything that was going on in Eden and the harmony you saw there. Remember, now it's after the fact, they've been pulled out of Egypt, but if I can just call it the Sabbath, because that's what all those other institutions point to, whether it's the sanctuary, Passover, etc., they point to the Sabbath. It's remember where you came from. Remember what you went through when you were in captivity. And if you remember that, you'll remember to stay humble as my people. You'll remember to do the work of protecting these principles of love your neighbor, human rights, essentially. So if you have no prophetic bearing, then you have no bearing as to what social justice means. Hence why we see Adventism in such disarray with regards to the sins that make up the man of sin, the seventh kingdom in today's context. The Millerites got it right in seeing what the sin was of the time, the sin of slavery, because they had a correct bearing with regards to the 2520. They don't frame it directly like that, but they understood that they were living in the time of the end because of the 2520. William Miller's work in doing that. When I say the 2520, it's really all the other time prophecies that encapsulate what the 2520 was about. So if you can accept that the 2520 is an institution that was intended to preserve God's principles, then you can see how a rejection of the 2520 ends up leading to you losing sight of principles of justice, mercy, of what the job function is. So now when we think about the ship of Alexandria, and in 1863 it goes off course, in 2001, that thing is going to be, a scourge is going to come against that ship, and methodology is the only thing that's going to hold that ship together. But come 2019 on that line, which is midnight, a message is going to come to Paul, and Paul's going to tell the other sailors that shipwreck is coming. This lines up with the cross that we spoke about over here. And what happened at the cross? What happened when Jesus was crucified? That curtain is torn, which means that these institutions have been abused for so long that I just cannot use them anymore. So they are not fulfilling their job function. So by the time you get to 2019, and the political events that are going on in 2019, that curtain is torn. That covenant has been broken to the point where shipwreck is now coming. 34 AD is, I'm going to say, inevitable, because you, the sixth kingdom, have stopped doing your job. You've forgotten what you were raised up to do. So I'm suggesting that Adventism's institutions, because we're comparing and contrasting the sixth kingdom with Adventism's institutions have been seen to be no longer fit for purpose. And then by the time you get to shipwreck, 34 AD, that church is passed by, and a new church with new institutions needs to be raised up to safeguard those two principles of love God and love your neighbor. Some of the institutions that we can think of that were meant to be the pillars of Adventism to ensure that they remain on course in doing God's work are, one, we've spoken about, the 2520, so prophecy. The two that Ellen White says directly, marriage and the Sabbath. So I'll stick with those three for now. Prophecy, we've seen how an incorrect understanding of the 2520 or prophecy can lead one, Adventism, to lose sight of its purpose, of recognizing the man of sin. Marriage, that's easy to see with the church's position on marriage with regards to same-sex marriage, and everything that's encompassed in relationships. The idea of head of the home, the idea of being anti-gay marriage, and etc. Because of not remembering who they were and not remembering the times in which Adventism were living in, there's this lack of recognition of where God wanted to take their people, us, in seeing how this was meant to be a progressive truth, where Adventism could stand up, get the message, and grow and see that actually this thing that God gave us, marriage, is a blessing, in seeing equality in marriage, in seeing the recognition of same-sex marriage, and etc. And the Sabbath, about 2 months ago, Elder Terry did a study on the Sabbath and how it's a memorial of creation. It's a memorial of equality. Equality not just between Adam and Eve, but really it's harmony with regards to humanity and God, because that's what all parables are. Parables are things that point to your relationship with God. So this harmony that existed in Eden, in the context which the Sabbath was given, was a thing to say, remember that. Remember the harmony that you humans once had, that the environment had with each other, that you had with the environment, that you had with God. That's what equality is, harmony. Now, if you forget that, then you end up breaking the principles that the Sabbath was meant to remind us of. And so this incorrect understanding of the Sabbath that Adventism has, I'll say, developed, has led to the abuse of these principles, i.e., the neglect of them in seeing how they were meant to develop and pointing us to those two fundamental principles: love God and love your neighbor. There's various other institutions that we could list out that Adventism was meant to protect and use for the betterment of the two principles that we've discussed, whether it's truth and doctrine, with how the church has handled opposing views with regards to the truth. Ordination, you could think of some in your own time. Those are just some. But there's various institutions of Adventism that, just like ancient Israel, have become corrupted and unfit for purpose. Hence why God has to raise up this movement to put these institutions in their correct place so they can point us to those true principles that God wants to teach and cultivate in us. So now thinking about the sixth kingdom and the sin of the sixth kingdom. If we can think of it in that context, with regards to the interplay between institutions and principles, then we can get to the core issue that has meant that the sixth kingdom has failed, that it gets shipwrecked at the Sunday law. The sin that we point to in Adventism is not that in Adventism there are people who do not pay tithe. There's individual bad people who are not nice. It's a story about institutions and principles. The reverse of that is when we think about what makes us a success, what makes this movement a movement of success, the thing that makes this movement a movement of success are the various institutions that the movement has created from 1989. Methodology is an institution. In understanding correct methodology, that's an institution that's been put in its rightful place. The institutions surrounding how we view marriage as a movement, the institutions regarding ordination, prophecy, the Sabbath, and the fact that the Sabbath is really a pointer to equality, how we deal with disputes in the movement, doctrinal and moral. Those are the various institutions that I think make this movement a success. It's that they've been put in their rightful place. And this is a study for another day, but come the Sunday law, that's the point in which we should recognize that all the institutions that make this movement a movement of success, or should make it a movement of success, have been put in their rightful place. Because without those institutions in their rightful place, the movement cannot do its job function. So before discussing present day, I want to take us back to 1863 to discuss when that ship goes off course and see what the issue was with the sixth kingdom that led it to go off course. We have everything related to In God We Trust, this coming together of church and state and etc. But more broadly, in the Civil War, there were two things taking place with the North and the South. The North Kingdom, if we can simply say it this way, the North represents the sixth kingdom, the defender, protector of the people, the ship of Alexandria. The South, the seventh kingdom, the resurrected beast, the king of the North in that history. Where is this? 1T 264 onwards, Ellen White is going to describe the Civil War. So I'll just draw some snippets from that chapter about slavery and the war. He says, God is punishing this nation for high crimes of slavery. So slavery is the issue. But there's two perspectives. God is going to punish the South for the sin of slavery. There's perspective one. And the North for essentially not doing enough to stop the sin of slavery. So not using the institutions that it has to kill off this sin. Loosely, we can call it compromise. I think it's more complicated than just saying compromise, but we'll just call it compromise for now. And in that chapter, she's going to point out that God is going to scourge the North because they've not done enough to fight against slavery. And they've strength in not doing enough. They've created an environment where the South feels that they can do what they want to perpetuate this sin. So their lack of action is the thing that has created the environment for the South to take advantage of the situation, essentially. And she goes on in that chapter describing this in various ways back and forth, how at times during the Civil War where the North really could have won, God wanted to punish the North, and so the South win in an event that really the North should have won, and etc. But the key takeaway from that chapter is the North created an environment by failing to do something where the South could take advantage of that environment and perpetuate the sin of slavery. So we get to 1863, and Abraham Lincoln is going to be forced to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. When I say forced, I mean it's God twisting Abraham Lincoln's arm through the Civil War to do that. Abraham Lincoln, or the North, shouldn't have had to have the Civil War to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. That should have just have been a natural outgrowth of the Sixth Kingdom's journey from 1798. And Ellen White describes it in that way, not in those words, but she's going to show that God really had to force the situation. God had to twist the arm of the North to be able to do that. So in thinking of the ship going off course in 1863, I know it's Abraham Lincoln passing the Emancipation Proclamation, and that's a good thing. But the reasons or the things that brought the North to do that, I'm suggesting, are because it forgot. It forgot who they were. The 2520 is ultimately about remembering who you are, your identity as a covenant people, your identity in 1798, where you created this covenant with the Constitution in the years prior to protect the people, to learn from everything that you've been through and remember who you are. That new kingdom is going to rise out of the ashes of papal captivity. This was like a coming out moment, just like the Exodus. It was the Israelites coming out of Exodus. So if we can line those up, that's Egypt, and this is your 1260. And in both instances, a people are going to be drawn out of that captivity. In this case, it was the Sixth Kingdom, and in this case, it was ancient Israel. And in both instances, it's really remember what you've been through. Now remember to create an environment that doesn't let that rise up again. But just like ancient Israel, the USA forgets. It doesn't literally forget the 25-20, but I'm going to say it rejects the 25-20 by forgetting the scattering that they were in. And so it forgets its story, the long arc of its identity. In rejecting the discipline and memory of captivity, it becomes vulnerable to allowing an environment where the beast can rise up. So when we consider ancient Israel as the glorious land, while it fails to remember the purpose of its institutions, I ask the question, does it ever become Babylon? So here's ancient Israel. It's under the time period of the kings, pre-Babylonian exile. They've started worshipping idols. They've forgotten their role in the world, and God is going to bring a scourge against them, the king of the north, Babylon. They go into captivity, and in that captivity, does ancient Israel, the glorious land, ever become Babylon? No, it never becomes Babylon. It may take on its doctrines. The people get brainwashed, they buy into its doctrines, but it never becomes Babylon. That's the natural. And I think that we've made this case in relation to Adventism. The fact that Adventism never becomes Babylon. Ellen White hones this in, that the church is not Babylon. It never was, it never is, and never will be. So if we can say that about the church aspect, Adventism, and we see Adventism as a reflection or something we can compare and contrast with the sixth kingdom, not Babylon. And we can compare and contrast the two because both reflect the glorious land in different ways. What can we say about the sixth kingdom? Going back to our discussion at the beginning about Revelation 17, the beast that was, is not, will be, and the king, the five fallen, is and shall ascend, and etc. As we compare and contrast the two. That the sixth kingdom never was, is not, and never will be Babylon. Babylon being the king of the north. This is, for me at least, important to distinguish between, because when we start considering the sixth kingdom as the lamb, I guess there's studies being done or conversations being had of what the sin is of the sixth kingdom. So if we can get the sin of the sixth kingdom correctly, we can understand its punishment, we can understand its failure, and hopefully when making application, we can see where it went wrong. This, as the glorious land, may stop doing its job function like ancient Israel, but it never becomes Babylon, just like Adventism. Adventism may take on various Babylonian doctrines, may get drunk off the wine of Babylon. It may take on the idolatry of Babylon, but it never becomes it, just like the sixth kingdom. In our first presentation, we spoke about the seventh kingdom. And we framed that in the context of state nationalism. That's what makes the seventh kingdom the seventh kingdom. So based on this, And what happened with ancient Israel, that it goes into captivity, but it never becomes the thing. If the seventh kingdom is framed under state nationalism, then the sin of the sixth kingdom cannot be state nationalism. It cannot be that it is like Babylon. It cannot be a Babylonian system of rule, which is state nationalism. I framed the sin of ancient Israel as, I'm going to call it covenant amnesia, forgetting. They had a covenant, that covenant being the various institutions, and that covenant was to protect the principles, human rights. And they forgot. That's the sin of the sixth kingdom, where Babylon exalts itself and imposes a tyrannical way of government. The sixth kingdom isn't guilty of conquest or corruption in its origin, in who it is. What it's guilty of is forgetting its divine purpose, which was to be a land of refuge and liberty. Unlike the king of the north, which is driven by conquest and false worship, the sixth kingdom's transgression is neglect rather than rebellion. It's a failure to live up to its covenant calling. It's not guilty of becoming Babylon, but of failing to prevent Babylon's rise by abandoning what it was meant to do as the glorious land. The summary of all of that is that, I'll say this again in a different way, the sixth kingdom doesn't become Babylon. It fails to resist Babylon. Its sin isn't domination, but forgetfulness. It's not judged for what it does, it's judged for what it doesn't do, for its neglect. So we have two kingdoms, sixth, seventh. State nationalism, that's going to be used as a scourge against the glorious land. And your sixth kingdom, which essentially forgets. What has the sixth kingdom forgotten to do? Over time, there's been an understanding in the USA. Alderteri will phrase it as two visions for what the USA should be and should do. In one aspect, the USA was meant to be seen as a progressive state. So essentially, grow as you learn more about your job function. And this is what the sixth kingdom was meant to do. Grow in its job function as a progressive state. Over time, for various reasons, it stops doing that. It stops becoming this. It stops manifesting this progressive statehood. And the easiest thing to point at, in my mind, to see where it's failed to live up to its calling is with regards to abortion. So in America's history, there's been tension with regards to where abortion sits. Does it support at the state level or at a national level, at the federal government level? And then over time, it just became politicized, as we'll just call them the Republicans, sought to use that as a call to arms to get more votes. It was never as loaded as it is today with regards to inequality, but it got hijacked because Republicans saw that this is a good way to get votes. And so that issue gets politicized. But as that happens, Roe v. Wade gets passed to set a precedent for legal abortion. And the Democrats had the opportunity to codify that, to institutionalize that principle of a woman's right to pursue life, liberty, a woman's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But because they become lazy, the Democrats, they don't do it. To create an amendment, you need what you call supermajorities. Democrats had opportunities to do that, and they don't do it for whatever reason. But they become lethargic in their job function as protecting those principles that we've spoken about. That's just one instance. There's several others you can look to if you want to look to the economy and how they didn't resist the Reagan era politically enough. In fact, they compromised a lot with it. So now we end up in a situation where the right to pursue property is no longer protected. In 1989, to close, I said that the failure of the Sixth Kingdom is the failure of the Sixth Kingdom is creating an environment where the Seventh Kingdom could rise up. In this time period between 1798 and 1989, the Sixth Kingdom is it's managing the affairs of the USA, while the Seventh Kingdom is in the grave. And the Sixth Kingdom is essentially keeping it there, keeping it in the grave. Over time, we can point to how the Seventh Kingdom rears its head and tries to take control. But the Sixth Kingdom essentially is there to keep the seventh in the grave. But then something fundamentally happens that changes what's going to take place. Ronald Reagan is going to become president. And the period of US prosperity is going to start coming under attack. You had a welfare state that was created by FDR in the New Deal, and Reagan's going to undo all of that. That's internal policy. That's what makes MAGA MAGA. MAGA draws all of its inspiration from Reagan. It's Reagan. Trump's term at the moment is really Reagan 2.0. This is domestic policy. And then George Bush is going to stand up. He's going to win election. And when the Berlin Wall falls down, the new world order that he's going to describe is really this MAGA abroad. It's the USA as the sole superpower with the rest of the world. So these two elements, this culture or this environment, let me say this environment that's created around the time of the end, is what gives birth to the Seventh Kingdom. And through its course of from 1989 to the Sunday Law, the Sixth Kingdom is not going to resist the Seventh Kingdom in the strong fashion that it needs to. It's a civil war that we can point to from 2001 where there's push and pull, but it doesn't fight strong enough. God raises up the Seventh Kingdom to say, you Sixth Kingdom, you should have done more politically, but you didn't. So to summarize what we've gone through in the second half, I tried to demonstrate that when we think of the Sixth Kingdom, it's interchangeable with the Glorious Land. The reason why I wanted to do that, to show that the two are synonymous, is because we can compare and contrast the Glorious Land as the Sixth Kingdom with ancient Israel as the Glorious Land. And one of the key concepts that we know about the Glorious Land is that it never becomes Babylon. It may go into captivity into Babylon, but it never becomes it. So the king of the north may take the sixth kingdom into captivity, but the sixth kingdom can never be the king of the north. It's said parabolically in Revelation 17 with regards to the beast. The five are fallen, one is the sixth, and there's one yet to come. But there's a lot of questions around whether this sixth kingdom is the king of the north as well. And my intention was to try and demonstrate by comparing and contrasting with ancient Israel how that can't be the case. Even if that head is on the beast, it's not as straightforward as saying the head being on the beast means that the head is a manifestation of the beast. Because there's other models we can point to where that's not the case. So if anything, it makes us question, what does it mean for the head to be on the beast? So in that relationship with the USA being the glorious land, Adventism, the church is just one aspect of it. But in its primary sense, Daniel 11 verse 41, the USA being the glorious land that the king of the north goes into, there has to be a sin that the sixth kingdom does that the seventh kingdom punishes the sixth kingdom for as a tool in God's hand. And so I tried to start exploring what that could be by distinguishing between these two things, principles and institutions. Principles being founded in the Declaration of Independence, and your institution, simply put, being your laws, your constitutional framework. And for ancient Israel, that was the sanctuary system, the Jewish economy that were meant to protect, love God, love your neighbor. I went through one of those examples with Jesus rebuking the Pharisees for turning the sanctuary into something that served themselves. In the story of Christ at the cross, you get to the point where it was recognized that something has fundamentally changed with regards to ancient Israel. Those institutions no longer doing their job function. So Jesus needs and God need to set up a new organization that's going to shine the light properly on those institutions. Some of the institutions that we can point to in Adventism that it has failed to forget the purpose of are prophecy enshrined in the 2520, marriage, and the Sabbath. Without putting them in their correct framework, you end up forgetting who you are, really. We went to 1863 to point out how the sin of slavery falls on the shoulders of the South. The sin of the North is that they didn't do enough to stop the sin of slavery from rising up. They didn't keep the seventh kingdom suppressed. And so just to summarize all of that, it's to point to state nationalism points to the seventh kingdom, and covenant amnesia, if I can call it that, points to the sixth kingdom. This, I hope, will help us distinguish between what's going on at the Sunday law with regards to the punishment, what they're being punished for, who is who. So I haven't clearly defined who makes up the seventh kingdom and who makes up the sixth kingdom. I just wanted to try and put in place the framework in which that question could be understood. At a simple level, you could point to Republican, seventh kingdom, Democrats, sixth kingdom. But as you weave through history, I think you can see how it's a bit more complicated than that. And at some other point, perhaps we could explore that. But I hope that that made sense around why the seventh kingdom gets resurrected around 1989. There's an environment that gives it the opportunity to do so. The sixth kingdom didn't work hard enough at keeping this seventh kingdom in the grave, essentially. So we'll close with a word of prayer and then do a Q&A if that's the order of events. But please join me as we pray. Dear God, I praise and thank you for the 2520. Thank you that it has been established as the cornerstone of who we are. And it's my prayer that we may not forget its importance outside of it just being a number, but in relation to what it's meant to do for us, that we do not forget that there are institutions that we have that are there to protect the people. And so I pray that you may forgive us for at any time we have forgotten. And I pray that we may do the work that you have called us to do as a movement in building up those institutions again, so they can point to what you want us to learn in its rightful place. I pray all these things and ask for your blessings this Sabbath. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I'll hand over to okay, so we'll now do a Q&A. And I did two separate but connected presentations today, but I will try to answer any other questions that you may have about studies that I've done in the past or anything that you have. So over to you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Russell. You know me.
Yes.
Look, it's interesting, like how you explained the fifth, eighth, the sixth, and the seventh,
Mhm.
especially trying to show that the sixth is not actually part of the the beast. Uh, uh, as that the beast, the persecuting power.
Mhm.
Would you mind uh, 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 repeating the points clearly?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
So you just described the beast as a persecuting power. So if we just take that as fact that the beast is a persecuting power, it's a persecuting entity. In Revelation 17, we're going to be told about the beast and the person that's riding it. I just want to open up my eSword over here. So John is going to get an explanation about this beast that the kings have, or more clearly, there's two entities, a great prostitute and a beast. And John is going to explain to him the fact that there's this great whore that's going to sit on many waters. The kings of the earth are going to commit fornication with this great whore. But he's going to get an understanding of the beast and the woman. So in verse 7, the angel's going to say to John, let's consider everything that you've seen. I'm going to show you about the whore that we have and the beast. So two separate entities, and I'm going to show you something about both of them. About this church and this army. What we would call the King of the North, the state entity. And so the key distinction that I wanted to make when going through that is to show how there's 3 points in time in respect to where John is standing. There's the past, the present, and the future. So if we isolate those verses and go through them like step by step, in my perspective, you can see how they're different things. So verse 8, in talking about the beast that you saw was. The beast that you saw is not in the present, but it's going to ascend in the future. At some point, it's going to be resurrected. This is about the beast. That's what is being spoken about. And then in verse 10, in verse 9, John's going to be told, now the heads that you see on the beast follow a different pattern. There's going to be 5 that you saw. There's going to be 1 that is alive while the beast is dead. So at this point, it's alive while the beast is dead. And then there's 1 that's going to come in the future, the 7th, not yet. So I'm just to make it more clearly to come. So in going through this compare and contrast between the two, if the head equals the beast, and if the beast dies, is killed, then the head wouldn't be alive. Just think of the natural. If you kill off my body, you can't have an alive head. The head is dead. So my point is in showing that the 6 is alive and while the beast is dead is to show that the head is not the beast. It's not a representation of the beast. The 6th head, they're not interchangeable. Because while it is alive, the beast is dead. And while the beast is dead, it is alive. That's our middle column over here. That's my first proof that the 6th kingdom is not the king of the north. My second one is showing how the 6th kingdom is equal to the glorious land. The glorious land in the natural was ancient Israel. In the past, we've In fact, not even in our vows, it points out how Adventism never was, never is, and never will be Babylon. It never becomes Babylon. Despite its failings, despite how bad it looks, it never becomes Babylon. In the natural, ancient Israel never became Babylon. They may have adopted idolatry, they may have gone into captivity, they may have drunk from the wine of the cup, but ancient Israel never became Babylon. Babylon being the king of the north, because that's who comes against Judah. It's Nebuchadnezzar as the king of the north coming to take those Israelites captives and then destroy Jerusalem. So the glorious land, in the context of the church, never becomes Babylon. So in the context of the state, the glorious land, the USA, should follow a similar dynamic, that it never becomes Babylon. It never becomes the king of the north, just like Adventism never becomes the king of the north, despite its failings. So those, in my mind, are my two proofs, at least, to try and demonstrate and articulate that the sixth kingdom is not the king of the north. And that was all to distinguish between the sin of the sixth and the sin of the seventh being different, whatever those sins are. I call it, and in case other people might have called it, state nationalism. And this one, covenant forgetfulness. The covenant, which was essentially to protect the people, to be a defender and protector of the people. Adventism, that covenant was with regards to the church. It was meant to protect and defend the people in the church, the truth. And the sixth kingdom, USA, was meant to defend and protect the people in the nation as a whole. They had two different job functions. So yeah, I don't, was this bit a bit more clear, Russell?
Okay. Thank you. So you correct me if I'm wrong. This is
Mhm.
interesting. And from what you have demonstrated and said, what I can see during like the is not.
Mhm.
Yeah. What I can see from your board work, they're actually two heads. It's only that the other one is not. I don't know if I'm wrong. Then
Say
there
that
is
again, sorry.
okay. What I'm saying is there is the was, is not, and ascend.
That's the beast,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, that's the beast. So so we can see that the beast which was
Mhm.
is connected to the, we can say, the fifth head.
The five that are
Then
fallen. Yeah.
yes, yes.
Mhm.
Then the beast which is not, meaning during this time the beast is not connected to the sixth head.
Yes.
And the Bible continues that the seventh will come, and this seventh, it shall be connected with the beast.
Yes.
Yeah, it uses the language that it shall rule with the beast,
Mhm.
something like that. So and that in itself makes the sixth different from the five which are fallen,
Mhm.
and the seven, it
Yes.
has got no connection with the beast.
Yes.
Yeah. And it helps me also like to, because I had this problem when I look at Revelation 17, it helps me to see that during the sixth, the beast is not, meaning it's dead. Yeah, and the sixth head like who exists. So the sixth head must be something good because it's not connected with
The beast.
the beast. And John, though is limited, but I think he did the best because he's saying that the beast is not there. And but
Mhm.
he wants us to see that there is actually someone
Yes,
who is
there's
in this
something
time
that's alive.
period. Yes. And also at the same time, he wants to distinguish what is alive from these
Mhm.
other, the seventh and the other five which are fallen. I think it's clear, it makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I like the way you articulated it. There's a specific lesson that John is trying to teach. And for me, I don't think the lesson is that this head is on the beast, so it's part of Satan's kingdom. There's a there's a he's juxtaposing two entities, the sixth and the sixth kingdom and the beast, and all the other kingdoms that represent the beast. And he's juxtaposing them, bringing them together. So if you think of what juxtaposition is, it's going to force two things that do not belong together. And the way he's going to force them together is by putting the head on the beast. So here's all the different heads, and here's your beast. So juxtaposition says force these things that don't normally come together to put them together. So he's going to force it together by making that head on the beast. But in that juxtaposition, the point is to show the differences between the two, to show the distinction between the two. And what you've just described here is this time period over here where the beast is dead, the sixth is alive. So in reality, because I kept getting asked this question and I didn't have a good enough answer um, as to if the sixth kingdom is a good kingdom, why is it on the beast? And in my mind, I think that John is doing this deliberately so that we can better see the contrast between the two. It's classic juxtaposition. Force things together. So this good thing is being forced onto the body of a bad thing, not to show that they're the same, but to show that they're different. And so he goes through verse 10 and etc. to do that contrast. So yeah, I like the way you described it, and I think juxtapositioning is the answer to why that head is on the beast. So yeah, I don't know if there's any other questions. If not, then we could finish early, but I will leave it up to Russell's discretion.
Okay, if there is any person with a question, you can go ahead. And if there is none, maybe after 30 seconds, we can see the way forward.
Hello?
Yes, Joseph, you can go ahead, move close to the mic.
Yeah, can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah.
I just want to ask KTC, just want to get some clarifications, especially on the marker or the beginning of the waymark of Sunday law. In connection to what we are learning, especially in Liberation 13 and 17, what can we get from these chapters we have read to mark the resurrection of the beast, or the setting up of the image and the speaking of the image, and in relation to 18th July, because you just mentioned that in the beginning, you said we are, at least we are more settled on that one, but I wanted more clarity in what we have learned just now. How do we get the information, these best chapters, in relation to the beginning of the waymark of the Sunday?
So in our studies of the Sunday law, there's various aspects that you can take. You could do a study on when is the Sunday law, which would be the date, and that serves a purpose because it will tell you when does it start. I mean, with that date, you could say, okay, what does that date teach you? What do the events of that date teach you? So it could be just bringing up the different perspectives. It could be the RNC, the election, the I think what was the inauguration? Inauguration. Those are the three options, at least in people's minds. So what does this have to do with the win of the Sunday law or the election or this? Like, what are the characteristics there? And then there's a third thing, which I chose to explore in my studies today, which was, let's understand the seventh kingdom and the sixth kingdom more specifically, because it's related to this. So if I can frame today's studies as sin of 6 versus sin of 7. From my perspective, this doesn't answer question number 1. Today's study doesn't answer question number 1, and it was never intended to do so. It kind of doesn't even really answer question number 2. However, what I think this study does answer, for me at least, is when we start to consider, there's 2 things, and this will become clearer in the future in my studies. There's a sin and there's a punishment. What is that punishment? And who gives that punishment? So, if we think of the sin of the sixth kingdom, we need to ask ourselves, who is punishing the sixth? Like, who's God going to use to punish the sixth kingdom? And if we think of the seventh, again, who is God going to use to bring judgment against the seventh kingdom? So knowing what their sins are as distinguishable sins, I think can help us understand who and what this punishment is, as various studies are going to develop to try and demonstrate. So to put it frankly, I don't think today's study, it wasn't intended to answer the July 18 question or November 5 or January 20th. Instead, it was meant to try and put in place to have us clearly know who we're talking about when we talk about these kingdoms. my long and short of it is it doesn't answer the question you're asking. If you want an answer to the question you're asking, I'd have to describe something different. Yeah. So if you want to ask a different question, you can ask that question. But in essence, this doesn't answer anything about July 17. I mean, July 18. It serves a different purpose. Does that help? It doesn't help, but does it help? Who had to ask that question?
It's Joseph.
Yes. So my answer to your question is it doesn't answer the question you asked. But if you'd like me to answer a question, then I could try and give my proofs more simply as to July 17. I mean, July 18. Why do I keep saying 17? Oh, because we've been talking about Revelation 17 the whole morning.
Yeah, I've gotten you. I think that I've understood what you have said. But again, you talked about the mega. Where do you get that? Yeah, you brought it in connection to what we are learning in liberation. That's why now I brought that question where we can look into those things like the when and what. Yeah. I mean, even the ascension of the beast from the bottomless. Yeah.
The reason why I feel like it's disjointed from the when is because someone could take the study and see and say it's demonstrated in July, or it's demonstrated in November when people vote, or it's demonstrated in in January when Trump gets in. This is applicable to wherever you're going to point to in those things. You see MAGA in July, you see MAGA in January, you see MAGA being voted in November. The thing about MAGA was for us to conceptualize what MAGA is really. And in my mind, MAGA is this fusion of the American identity with the state itself. So that was presentation number one. It's this demonstration of what this resurrected, more glorious King of the North looks like. So that's why I say it's not really trying to answer the question of when, because a person could make the argument that you see this at any one of those dates in July, in November, or January. The key point was the what. So it's not the church telling the state what to do. It's Trump as king and God that is going to guide America in a specific direction. We call it state nationalism, to make America the greatest again. So, yeah. If we were to point to July, at least in my mind, I said that the sixth kingdom and the seventh kingdom, I may be corrected in the future, but I don't see it as a clean cut between Democrats and Republicans. The arguments that I've given for the Sunday law being in July are the role that the establishment plays in thinking about the sixth kingdom. So in 1798, we have a new nation rising. And in that constitution, it's going to be legalized. It's going to take the Declaration of Independence and package it into this codified system of laws and etc. You cannot have the sixth kingdom without these laws, or else it ends up just being a rebellious nation against tyranny, which in and of itself is it's a libertarian argument. It's this fight for liberty. That's what that whole Declaration of Independence is about. That's what that whole American Revolution is about with Great Britain. It's this libertarian driver. But if you don't have the constitution that follows, which I spoke about as institutionalizing that spirit, that ideology, then it just ends up being continual rebellion. And that's where you get populists come up. Populists are just people with a libertarian mindset who want change. Whether it's Julius Caesar in 63 BC or it's Donald Trump standing up in 2016 and today, he's a populist guided by this libertarian ideology to fight against the system. So in 1798, where you have these two kingdoms, the dragon is going to follow the woman into this haven, the USA. You have the 7th and the 6th. From my perspective, the 6th is best articulated or best seen in their decision, in the 6th decision, to institutionalize that libertarian fight, that libertarian ambition. And so today, when you get to today, and Donald Trump and the new Republicans are going to dismantle this system that was meant to protect that libertarian fight and divorce the libertarian ideology from the system by calling the system a swamp, the establishment is going to come under attack. And the establishment, I'm suggesting, has two faces. It has two roles. Number one is the progressive state, which, to put it simply, you can see in the Democrats, progressive state. And it has another. Keep the king of the north at bay. Keep the 7th kingdom from resurrecting. Keep the 7th kingdom dead. That's the establishment. Hence why the Tea Party movement that rises up in 2012 takes pop shots at Obama, because on the left, you have the progressive state. On your political spectrum, if you call this the center, you have your people like Obama, Clinton, etc. This is your center left. And then you have people like, now I'm forgetting their names. I'll put McConnell here as well. Mitch McConnell he's an establishment politician. I know that we point to him as, this evil man who's done a lot, but he's really an establishment politician. Hence why he doesn't like Trump. And then you have Trump here on the far right. There's someone specific. McCain. McCain was a Republican who sits on the center right. And there's various others. Romney. Yeah, Romney. That's a good one. So these are your establishment Republicans on the right. So this fight that the far right is going to come with, your Bannons, your Trumps, your Sessions, and etc. The list goes on. Musk, can put him there. This fight is going to be against this establishment. It's not really a fight against Bernie Sanders and everything that Bernie Sanders stands for, because Bernie Sanders is also fighting the establishment, this populist movement that's rising up on the left, because there's this belief that the establishment doesn't do enough. But this establishment is put in place to protect the 6th kingdom, to ensure a progressive state, as well as to keep the 7th kingdom dead, to keep the 7th kingdom in the grave, where it's in the bottomless pit. So in 2012, after Obama, passes all that legislation to create a welfare state and etc., the Tea Party are going to attack Obama. They're going to call him out, but they realize that they can't get much headway there. And so they start attacking the center-right. And the center-right are initially going to try to resist the Tea Party, but over time they end up getting swamped out, drained out. And so that's that story about the purging of the Republican Party. It's about this libertarian movement that feels that this establishment has become a monarchy, has become a king. Libertarian. So my studies have framed this as conservative compromise, not my studies today, but in studies past, as these are the gatekeepers of democracy, your center right. The reason why is because they are best suited to deal with this problem on the far right with your libertarians. They cannot, because populists appeal to the people. And so the easiest way to get a populist in is through pure democracy. It's through democracy because a populist is going to appeal to the wills of the people. So if you want to keep a dictator, which usually rises out of populism, if you want to keep a dictator out, what do you need to control? This center right needs to control this element to ensure that they never take over the party on the right. So if we think about France and other countries, the center right often compromise with the center left to ensure that the far right doesn't come in. In July, that was the point where this center right collapses. So this far right libertarian movement gets the opportunity to rule the nation. And you see this in 1933 Germany, you see it in 63 BC with Julius Caesar and his fight against the establishment. In various places, you see how it's this continual fight between the far right and the center right. And these people on the center right end up being the gatekeepers of democracy. They serve a purpose wider than just their own internal party politics. They serve a purpose at maintaining this establishment as a whole. They do a job, and the left do a job in ensuring this progressive state ends up defending the people. So, from my perspective, the Sixth Kingdom is this. It's your center right and your center left, both doing different jobs to ensure that the King of the North doesn't come back. So, coming to today's study and the sins of the kingdoms, why I want to articulate that and put it into its place, and perhaps one could argue now, I suppose, as it being a proof of this, is because if we see how the Seventh Kingdom gets overtaken by state nationalism, the Seventh Kingdom being over here, then the events of July, not the day of July 18, but what took place at that RNC, the crowning of the Republican Party as being overtaken by MAGA, this Make America the Greatest Again, or Make America Great Again, then that becomes an indication that we're living in the time period of the Seventh Kingdom, because this forms part of the Sixth Kingdom. And when this is purged, then the Sixth Kingdom is now being punished. So yeah, maybe that's a better answer for you. Did that make sense, Josie?
Yes, thank you so much. Make a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Munametsi?
Hi, Curtis. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Yeah, no, your study was quite elaborative and quite clear in many of its aspects. So you talked about SDA not being Babylon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I understand that. And maybe I think to add to your points, even Ellen G. White, I think she points to two things that makes the other churches Babylon. I think she points to Sunday observance as one of them. And then she points to the iniquitous connections with the state churches as the other thing that makes Babylon Babylon. So SDA does not have any of those two things. I think she talks about many other things, but I think those were the key things. But now you've just identified, so the seventh kingdom, in your opinion, now we are back at Babylon, right, in the seventh kingdom. But the sixth is not Babylon, but the seventh now becomes Babylon. The seventh kingdom, so that now the principles of the seventh kingdom, do you see SDA being swept by what will be happening in the seventh kingdom? Like getting under the umbrella, so to speak, of the seventh, the philosophy, the ideology of the seventh kingdom. And if you see SDA being swept by that, how do you now, will at that stage SDA continue not to be Babylon? Because if the seventh kingdom is Babylon and SDA gets swept by the ideology and the principles of the seventh kingdom, how does it not then become part of Babylon or itself even Babylon? I mean, how do you deal with that? I'm not sure if you get my question.
Yeah, I think I understand it. So the one thing that I can point to, because there's a principle that we have in Bible prophecy, which we're all aware of, which is line upon line. It's Solomon saying there's nothing new under the sun. We live in a repetitive cycle. So for me, that's my first point of reference with regards to understanding anything today. Does it have a precedence in the past? If there's no precedence, then I know that what I might think might be the case today can't be, because there's no precedence for it. So I took us back to ancient Israel. I took us back to the glorious land. In the glorious land, all the principles that made Babylon Babylon were idolatry, were, we'll just say, rejection of the Sabbath, were the various things that made Babylon Babylon. But when the glorious land, when Judah goes into captivity to Babylon, and you have all the Israelites start worshipping idols, they start taking on Babylonian customs, they start drinking of the wine of Babylon. They come out of that with a remnant. So Daniel refuses to eat at the king's table, and Israel effectively never becomes the thing that they go into captivity of. So that's my line, that's my history, that's my precedent. Again, Christ, the Jews, the Pharisees, they never end up becoming Rome. They may fall to Roman practices and etc., but they don't become Rome. It's the specific Christian church at the beginning that Paul is talking about, not talking about during the 1260 and etc. In essence, so when we come to today and we see how Adventism has drunk of the wine of Babylon, has taken into its supper what we'll just frame as patriarchy, to encompass the various things that you spoke about. It can take on that doctrine but it doesn't make it the thing that takes it into captivity, if that makes sense. So just like ancient Israel, while they may have performed the practices of Babylon, they still remained Israelites. They were never Babylonians. They never became Babylon. So now the antitype or the spiritual application would be Adventism. Despite believing in different Babylonian doctrines of the King of the North, we'll frame it under patriarchy, it never changes its name. It never changes who it is as Adventism. So it never becomes Babylon. And there's a remnant that gets pulled from the church. Each and every time there's a remnant that is reflective of Adventism to show that while there's some people who do some bad things, there's a remnant that's going to be called out who's going to reflect my church. In ancient Israel, that happened. But my point is that in that time period of captivity, from when Nebuchadnezzar takes him captive to when Artaxerxes sends them back home, or Cyrus, sorry, from when Cyrus starts that call for them to go back home, the Israelites stood as a separate and distinct kingdom who may have taken on Babylonian customs and teachings, but they were still a separate entity. So today, I'm suggesting it's the same dynamic. With respect to Adventism, the church side, and with respect to the sixth kingdom, the state side. Does that answer you?
Yeah, no, I think I get you. But so you've just talked about the sixth kingdom and SDA, right? But with respect to the seventh kingdom and SDA. So, but anyway, I think I got a logic anyway. Let me not go in there. The last thing that I wanted to was the Republican right or center right being the gatekeepers. So if they're the gatekeepers of democracy, as you say, but as we pointed out also, they had a sin that they committed, the sin that allowed the far right to then now come in and take left.
Oh, you broke up for a bit. I didn't hear that last bit.
So the center right and the center left. That simply means they were not quite good gatekeepers, were they? Because I mean, they committed something that allowed the compromised some of the sin that they committed, allowed the far right to come in. So that simply means even though they were set up as gatekeepers, they were not that good gatekeepers, were they? That's why the far right had to. I think that's the whole point of your study, right?
Yeah, that I think for a big part of the USA's history, this center right were really good gatekeepers. There were several populists who tried running throughout the USA's lifetime. I'm forgetting their names, but a big one that rose up in 1992 and then tried running in 96, Pat Buchanan. And then another one. They essentially tried running on the Republican ticket, and Republicans, interestingly enough, endorsed a Democrat president, a Democrat nominee, I think it was for senator, to make sure that that far right person doesn't come in. So even up till 1996, they were acting as gatekeepers in a strong way. But then as time went on, because of the expediency of wanting to win, the Republican Party started failing in its job as a gatekeeper. So the center, I think there's two different roles that they play in the Sixth Kingdom. The right, gatekeepers; the left, this progressive state. And that's what makes the establishment the establishment. Keep out dictators and progress the nation. Grow with our human rights. So yeah, they became lazy, essentially, the left. They forgot their job function. And here, they also forgot their job function to keep out dictators. So at one point, I think they both did a good job, but then time moves on and they stop doing their job function, both of them. And so the Sixth Kingdom ends up being scourged. I don't think I said anything differently to how you described it.
Yeah, no. I guess thanks for the study. It was a good study, in my opinion.
Thank you. I think that you can pray, Ketis.
Okay, let's pray to close. Dear God, thank you for each and every opportunity you give us to grow in our understanding of the great controversy. We are each limited in what we can do, but we know that as a collective we can grow. Where two or three are gathered, we know that you're there, and we know that it is your will that the truth shines brighter. And so I thank you that it is more than just one. It's two or three that are gathered in your name. I pray and ask that we may do the work that you have raised us up to do. And I thank you for the opportunity to do that work, because it's in doing that work that we ourselves can grow as a movement, as an institution, and as individual people. I praise you always in Jesus' name. Amen.